Hey everyone, this is the preface to the prophet Outcast, Trotsky 1929 to 1940 by Izaak Deutscher. This volume concludes my trilogy about Trotsky and relates the catastrophic denouement of his drama. At the denouement, the protagonist of a tragedy is usually more acted upon than acting, yet Trotsky remains Stalin's active and fighting antipode to the end. Stalin's sole vocal antagonist. Throughout these 12 years, from 1929 to 1940, no voice could be raised against Stalin in the USSR, and not even an echo could be heard of the earlier intense struggles, except in the groveling confessions of guilt to which so many of Stalin's adversaries had been reduced. Consequently, Trotsky appeared to stand quite alone against Stalin's autocracy. It was as if a huge historic conflict had become compressed into a controversy and feud between two men. The biography has had to show how this had come about and to delve into the complete circumstances and relationships which, while enabling Stalin to, quote, strut about in the hero's garb, end quote, made Trotsky into the symbol of the sole mouthpiece of the opposition to Stalinism. Together, therefore, with the facts of Trotsky's life, I have had to narrate the tremendous social and political events of the period, the turmoil of industrialization and collectivization in the USSR, the Great Purges, the collapse of the German and European labor movements under the onslaught of Nazism, and the outbreak of the Second World War. Each of these events affected Trotsky's fortunes, and over each he took his stand against Stalin. I have had to go over the major controversies of the time, for in Trotsky's life the ideological debate is as important as the battle scene is in the Shakespearean tragedy, though through it the protagonist's character reveals itself while he is moving towards catastrophe. More than ever before, I dwell in this volume on my chief character's private life, and especially on the fate of his family. Again and again, readers will have to transfer their attention from the political narrative to what common parlance insists on describing as the, quote, human story. As though public affairs were not the most human of all preoccupations, and as if politics were not a human activity par excellence. At this stage, Trotsky's family life is inseparable from Trotsky's political fortunes. It gives a new dimension to his struggle and it adds somber depth to his drama. The strange and moving tale is told here for the first time on the basis of Trotsky's intimate correspondence with his wife and children, a correspondence to which I have been privileged to obtain unrestricted access. For this I am indebted to the generosity of the late Natalia Sedova, who 2 years before her death asked the librarians of Harvard University to open to me the so-called sealed section of her husband's archives, the section that by his will was to remain closed until the year 1980. I would like to comment briefly on the political context in which I have produced this biography. When I started working on it at the end of 1949, official Moscow was celebrating Stalin's 70th birthday with a servility unparalleled in modern history, and Trotsky's name seemed covered forever by heavy calumny and oblivion. I had published The Prophet Armed and was trying to complete the first draft of what is now The Prophet Unarmed and The Prophet Outcast when, in the latter part of 1956, the consequences of the 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, the October upheaval in Poland, and the fighting in Hungary compelled me to interrupt this work and turn my whole attention to current affairs. In Budapest, raging crowds had pulled down Stalin's statues, while in Moscow the desecration of the idol was still being carried out stealthily and was treated by the ruling group as their family secret. Quote, "We cannot let this matter go out of the party, especially to the press," end quote. Khrushchev warned his audience at the 20th Congress. Quote, "We should not wash our dirty linen before the eyes, bracket, of our enemies," end quote. Quote, "The washing of the dirty linen," end quote, I then commented, quote, "can hardly be carried on behind the back of the Soviet people much longer. It will presently have to be done in front of them and in broad daylight. It is, after all, in their sweat and blood that the, quote, dirty linen," end quote, was soaked. And the washing, which will take a long time, will perhaps be brought to an end by hands other than those that have begun it, by younger and cleaner hands," end quote. Izaak Deutscher. The prophet Outcast is appearing after some washing of the, quote, dirty linen has already been done in public, and after Stalin's mummy has been evicted from the Red Square mausoleum. A perceptive Western cartoonist reacted to this latest event with a drawing of the mausoleum in which Trotsky could be seen placed in the crypt just vacated and next to Lenin. The cartoonist expressed an idea which probably occurred to many people in the USSR, although it is to be hoped that the, quote, rehabilitation of Trotsky, when it comes, will be carried out in a manner free from cult, ritual, and primitive magic. Meanwhile, Khrushchev and his friends are still exerting themselves to keep in force the Stalinist anathema on Trotsky. And in the controversy between Khrushchev and Mao Zedong, each side accuses the other of Trotskyism, as if each were bent on providing at least negative evidence of the vitality of the issues raised by Trotsky and of his ideas. All these events have sustained my conviction of the topicality as well as the historical importance of my theme, but pace some of my critics. They have not significantly affected either my approach or even the design of my work. True, this biography has grown in scale beyond all my original plans. I have produced 3 volumes instead of 1 or 2. However, in doing so, I obeyed solely, and at first reluctantly, the literary logic of the work and the logic of my research, which was unexpectedly growing in scope and depth. The biographical material struggled under my hands, as it were, for the shape and the proportions proper to it, and it imposed its requirements on me. I know that what I am saying will not exculpate me in the eyes of one critic, a former British ambassador to Moscow, who says that he has, quote, always held that the Russian Revolution has never taken place, end quote, and who therefore wonders why I should devote so much space to so unreal an event. As to my political approach to Trotsky, this has remained unchanged throughout. I concluded the first volume of the trilogy in 1952 with a chapter titled Defeat and Victory, where I portrayed Trotsky as the pinnacle of power. Trotsky at the pinnacle of power. In the preface to that volume, I said that on completing his life, I would consider, quote, the question whether a strong element of victory is not concealed in Trotsky's very defeat, end quote. This precisely is the question I discussed in the closing pages of The Prophet Outcast in a postscript entitled Victory and Defeat. A note about sources and acknowledgments. The narrative of this volume is based even more strongly than that of the previous volumes on Trotsky's archives, especially on Trotsky's correspondence with the members of his family. Whenever I refer to the archives in general, I have in mind their open section, which is accessible to students at the Houghton Library, Harvard University. When I draw on the, quote, sealed part of the archives, I refer to the, quote, closed section. A general description of the open section was given in the bibliography of the Prophet Armed. The closed section is described in the bibliography attached to the present volume. Most of the 20,000 documents of the closed section consists of Trotsky's political correspondence with adherents and friends. Trotsky stipulated that this should be sealed because at the time when Trotsky transferred his papers to Harvard University in the summer of 1940, nearly the whole of Europe was either under Nazi or under Stalinist occupation, and the future of many countries outside Europe looked uncertain, and so Trotsky felt obliged to protect his correspondence. But there was little or nothing strictly confidential or private in the political content of that correspondence. Indeed, with much of it I had become familiar in the 1930s. I shall presently explain in what way, so that rereading it in 1959, I found hardly anything that could startle or surprise me. Trotsky's family correspondence, on the other hand, and even Trotsky's household papers, also contained in the closed section, have revealed to me his most intimate experiences and feelings and have greatly enriched my image of his personality. Some reviewers of the earlier volumes have complained that my references to the archives are not detailed enough. I can only point out that whenever I cite any document from the archives, I say either in the text or in a footnote by whom the document was written, when it was written, and to whom it was addressed. This is all that any student needs. More detailed annotation might have added impressively to my, quote, scholarly apparatus, but would be of no use either to the general reader, who has no access to the Trotsky archives, or to the scholar, whom the indications I provide should enable to locate easily any paper I refer to. Moreover, since I worked on my earlier volumes, the archives have been rearranged so that any more specific markings I might have given would have become valueless by now. E.g., I might have indicated that document X or Y is in section B, folder 17, but in the meantime, section A or B or C has ceased to exist! ! The material is now arranged in simple chronological order, and as I usually give the date of any document quoted, the student should find the item at a glance in the excellent 2-volume index to the archives available at the Houghton Library. One or two critics have wondered just how reliable are the archives and whether Trotsky or his followers have not, quote, doctored documents. To my mind, the reliability of the archives is overwhelmingly confirmed by the internal evidence, by cross-references to other sources, and by the circumstance that the archives provides Trotsky's critics as well as Trotsky's apologists with all the material they may want. Trotsky indeed was above falsifying or distorting documents. As to Trotsky's followers, these have, either from lack of interest or from preoccupation with other matters, hardly ever looked into the master's archives. In 1950, my wife and I were the first students to work on Trotsky's papers since Trotsky had parted with them. In relating to the climate of ideas and describing the parties, groups, and individuals involved in the inter-communist struggles of the 1930s, I drew inter alia on my own experience as a spokesman of anti-Stalinist communism in Poland. The group with which I was associated then worked in close contact with Trotsky. Trotsky's International Secretariat supplied us with very abundant documentation, some of it confidential, with circulars, copies of Trotsky's correspondence, etc. As writer and debater, I was deeply involved in nearly all the controversies described in this volume. In the course of the debates, I had to acquaint myself with an enormous political literature, with Stalinist, Social Democratic, Brandlerist, and other pamphlets, books, periodicals, and leaflets published in many countries. Naturally enough, only a small part of the literature was available to me at the time of writing, just enough to check the accuracy of my impressions and memories and to verify data and quotations. My bibliography and footnotes do not therefore pretend to exhaust the literature of the subject. I have been fortunate in being able to supplement the material drawn from the archives and from printed sources by information obtained from Trotsky's widow, from Alfred and Margaret Rosmer, Trotsky's closest friends in the years of banishment, and Jean Martin de Pellier, who transmitted to me papers and correspondence of Leon Sadov, Trotsky's elder son, from Pierre Frank, Trotsky's secretary in the Principal period, from Joseph Hansen, secretary and bodyguard at Koyoakan, and close eyewitness of Trotsky's last days and hours, and from many other people who were Trotsky's adherents at one time or another. Of those listed here, Natalia Sadova, Marguerite Rosmer, and Jean Martin died before I completed this volume. Outside the circle of Trotsky's family and followers, I am obliged to Konrad Knudsen and his wife, who were Trotsky's hosts in Norway, and to Mr. Helge Krogh and Mr. and Mrs. N.K. Dahl for much information and vivid reminiscences about the circumstances of Trotsky's internment and deportation from Norway. I interviewed Mr. Tirgov Lai, who was the Minister of Justice responsible for both the admission of Trotsky and Trotsky's internment. But Mr. Lai, having spoken to me at great length and self-revealingly, then asked me to refrain from quoting him, saying that his memory had misled him and that, in addition, under a contract with an American publisher, he was not allowed to disclose this information otherwise than in his own memoirs. Mr. Lai was good enough, however, to send me the official report on Trotsky case which he had submitted to the Norwegian Parliament early in 1937. I have also had the benefit of interviewing Professor H. Koht, Norway's Minister of Foreign Affairs at the times of Trotsky's stay in that country, who was most anxious to establish in detail the truth of the case. In investigating another important chapter in Trotsky's life, I approached the late John Dewey, who gave me an illuminating account of the Mexican counter-trial and spoke freely about the impression Trotsky made on him. I am indebted to Dr. S. Ratner, Dewey's friend and secretary, for valuable information about the circumstances in which the old American philosopher decided to preside over the counter-trial. Of many other informants, I would like to mention Mr. Joseph Berger, once a member of the Comintern staff in Moscow, who then spent nearly 25 years in Stalin's concentration camps. Mr. Berger has related to me his meeting in 1937 with Sergei Sadov, Trotsky's younger son, in the But-Irki prison of Moscow. My special thanks are due to the Russian Research Center, Harvard University, especially to Professors M. Feinsod and M.D. Schulman for the facilities they offered me, and to Dr. R.A. Brower, master of Adams House, and his wife, whose pleasant hospitality I enjoyed while working on the closed section of the Trotsky archives in 1959. I am gratefully obliged to Professor William Jackson and Miss C.E. Jakeman of Houghton Library for their infinitely patient helpfulness, and to Mrs. Elena Zorudnaya Levin for assisting me in reading some of the documents in the archives. To Mr. John Bell, Mr. Dan M. Davin, and Mr. Donald Tyerman, who have read my manuscript and proofs, I am grateful for criticisms and many suggestions for improvements. My wife's contribution to this volume has not been only that of unfailing assistant and critic. In the course of many years, ever since 1950, when we first pored together over the Trotsky archives, she absorbed the air of this tragic drama, and through her sensitive sympathy with its personae, she has helped me decidedly to portray their characters in narrating their fortunes. The end. Thank you for listening.